catch up on your end. Okay, so we're going through 2 Samuel and we're grabbing cultural nuggets, seeing how our ancestors live, learning from their mistakes. And this week, well, starting with last week, was very heavy because it's always a hard journey watching our heroes go through adversity, whether it's self-created or whether it is because of things that are outside of their control. David has triumphed greatly as we have progressed to this point in the narrative. And we are going to see one of our greatest kings, a man that Yah called a man after his own heart, enter into adversity. It is something that really weighed heavy on me last week. And anytime I teach, or especially when you all read on the other end of the lesson, it is always a good practice to reflect. And sometimes the reflection leads us into areas of healing and bringing out other elements of our own lives that we probably have laid dormant or are often triggered by the text. And so this hill and valley, mountain experience and low experience is something that we all go through. And the indiscretion of King David is put at our disposal, not for us to feel something about him as king, but for us to have to look at ourselves. And one of the things that, and I'll probably repeat this a lot throughout the lesson, one of the things that weighed heavily on me last week and caused me to really give this study an additional week, and we're actually going to sit with it for probably another week because we're only going to do part 1 this week. It made me think about something, and I want you guys to kind of reflect on this. When we begin our walk with the Most High, we have lofty expectations of ourselves, and we start off with goals in mind, not that we shouldn't. And as we begin to journey, we notice our humanity and how we seem to let ourselves down and we seem to let Yah down. And our lives are each significant. But when we look at the life of David, his life was so significant to Yah that he actually uses him beyond his time on this earth. He's mentioned over and over again. We're talking about him now. And the thought that crippled me, if I could use that word, or struck me and then paralyzed me with fear is, if David could fall, then is there any hope for me? And we began walking with Yah, and we are reclaiming our culture and our identity, and we're trying to walk circumspect. And when we look at it from the outside in, and we'll kind of get into the dialogue about what may have happened, what may not have happened, and what was on his mind. But the reality is we can be this close to Yah in one area and fall away so quickly. I was talking to my nephew and one of the greatest young minds I know in this day and age when it comes to the studying of the Bible and just inquisitiveness. And we were talking about this idea of sin and proximity and its proximity to righteousness. And as we go into this, I want you guys to think about that when there is good being done, the wicked also around us increases. Why? Well, it's increasing in order to try us. It's increasing to prove us. So I spent a lot of time going through the book of Job this week, and we look at a man who is righteous and he's living right, and calamity falls him. And David's situation is not necessarily one of Job, because Job, in the sense, was blameless, and Yah allowed the hedge of protection to be taken down. But in the same way, think of this idea that as we walk, we think that things are always going to get easier. But it's not that things get easier. It's that our ability to cleave to Yah and our necessity to cleave to Yah has to get stronger. We cannot rest in times of peace. We have to be on guard. We have to be guarding. Shamar is the Hebrew word. We have to put a hedge of protection around his word and also ourselves with his word, so that everything is done circumspect to Yah, because the enemy gets stronger when we fall. I'm going to explain that, and I'm going to get into our text. So darkness, if you want to use that word, needs light. It needs it. It's like, I don't know, I'll use movies like when you have it was a movie, Doctor Strange, and these people are going around and they're collecting these stones so that one person can be powerful, but they're taking a little bit of power from powerful people and collecting it to themselves to reign. Well, no, that's just fictitious. But the reality is, when we stumble and fall because of sin, it gives the adversary a little boost of confidence. It gives our enemies a boost of confidence to say, you're not as protected as I thought you were, or, oh, you're weak. And then that's the moment when the adversary comes in and attacks. It's those small chipping away, because see, the adversary couldn't get David with the big things. Couldn't. He slowly chipped away with the small things. And I know we mentioned this before, but we talked about the little foxes that spoil the vine. It's the small things. It's the continual going into negative areas that cause the big stumble. It's like walking on rocky ground with high heels. Eventually, you're going to hit a rock and stumble. The same is true with sin. If you are not prepared, if you are not equipped, if you go in and with the wrong mindset, it's going to lead to a stumble. And sometimes that stumble can be, in some people's cases, life ending. It could be the upending of everything. And so I want us to think about that before we go into the story and examine somebody else's story. Let us think about ourselves and this idea that as we grow in righteousness, we become a bigger target. See, people have it twisted. You think when people fall into sin, it's like, oh, that person was just pretending to be something. No. They were being it. And that's what made them a target for the adversary. See, a lot of people blame a lot of stuff on Hasatan. Everybody blames, oh, the devil made me do it, or the devil tempted me. No. The propensity to sin rests in you. We'll get to that today as well. You have it. And so we're not only fighting an outside enemy, but in subduing our inner enemy, then once we get into a place where we've worked on that, then the adversary comes. And many people don't reach that point. You're still warring with yourself most of the time and blaming it on the devil. No, it's you. It's definitely you. And so, but as we begin to walk in righteousness, as we begin to walk in Torah, and our light begins to shine, sin is like a moth drawn to a flame. The adversary is like a moth drawn to a flame. It's like, oh, you think that you're going to get away from this? I'm coming for you. And so we have to be guarded. We have to be guarded. And we're going to walk through that over the next couple of weeks. All right, let's get in it. 2 Samuel chapter 11. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and sieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. In chapter 10, we learned that David sends out men to bring a bereavement gift, if you will. He comes to comfort Hanun, who is a son of Nachash, who has passed. And, they tell him, oh, don't think that David's coming to bring a gift. Actually, what's happening, he's coming to spy. They embarrass the men, shave off half their beards and cut their, garment up the rear area and send them away ashamed. And so it starts this war, but David doesn't go. So we learn when it says still tarried is that he still is at Jerusalem. When the text opens up, it says in the spring of the year at the time when kings go out to battle. So as we're reading through the text and we're trying to get an understanding of what's happening, it's not enough, unless it's your first time. We've talked about this in previous studies. If your first time, you're going to read through it, you're getting familiar. But as you're studying, now we're looking at everything. We're fine-tooth combing it because we're trying to make sure we're seeing what's happening. So a picture is being painted here. And it says, as it came to pass after the year was expired. So we know that from the time of the war last year till now, it's been a year. And the word actually used here it means at the return, teshuvah. Shana. So it's saying at the return of the year, meaning it's leading towards spring. Springtime is when kings go out to battle. At that time, they didn't go out to battle all the time. Ecclesiastes 3:8 says there's a time for peace and a time for war. There is a wartime, and in the ancient Near East culture, the wartime was in spring. Favorable conditions, you could battle, you had the best advantage, because war wasn't just something that was just fought for fun or fought to put money in people's pockets. War was fought to gain territory. And so when you went out to battle, you went out in the most favorable circumstances that allowed for the best acquisition of territory. You're trying to fight and you're not good at fighting in the cold, or if it's raining and it's muddy, you're putting your men at danger. But in the spring, it's new, it's not too cold, it's not too hot, and it's a better time to go into battle. So the kings would go out to battle. Second thing we learn about the text is that kings go out to battle. Kings are not like, presidents of our day and age now, where they get a military and they send them out and they sit back and they orchestrate things from behind. No, the king went out to battle with the people because the king was a captain over the army. You led your people into battle. When they got rough and you needed to encourage them, having their king out there, they realized the king was this picture of the kingdom. It was a representative of everything back home. And so you didn't want your king to fall, because that meant your kingdom would fall. So not only did you protect your king, but the protection of the king also meant the protection of the kingdom. In our culture, our king acts as a representative for Yah. So our king, along with our priests and our prophets, should be praying to Yah during wartime to make sure that we are fighting correctly, that they're not out breaking Torah, so that we could be successful in battle. So a king in our culture that's not at battle is kind of a vulnerability. I'll get into that in a second. So David has an assignment. As king, he has somewhere to be and he has an assignment. In the previous chapter, David stayed back as well, as we see. We don't get a reason why he stayed back. This that's going to occur as we lead on is after a year of, last year there was war in the text. Last year there was war with the Syrians. Then, there's this downtime during the, winter months, and then there's battle time again. We know that in the last chapter that David eventually does go out to battle. Remember, he takes the men and the rest of them, they're in Jerusalem, and they go up and they fight against the Syrians and they subdue them. And that's how the chapter ends. So I spent most of the week theorizing. Not all these things are true. I just theory, putting them out there, letting you all in my head and allowing you all to begin to follow along as we move through the text. Spent the week theorizing and looking into the word to see if there were any clues. Like, what is happening? If you don't know anything about 2 Samuel chapter 11, then I guess you're going to have to go with the part of this that's like, oh, it's suspenseful. But clues on why David stayed back in the first place. So here are two plausible reasons. After discussing, I spoke with Maury, went round and round in my brain. So my first theory is, with highs comes lows. No one is on all the time. Being a man of battle has to take a toll on a person, just in general, fighting just for the past 20 years easily. Can't be easy on a person. So the same is true of life. When we are constantly working, there comes a time where being still is needed. David had wives and children and may have just wanted to enjoy life. The interesting thing about wanting to rest and enjoy life is that the enemy never sleeps. Even after the kingdom was established, there were still groups who wanted to, in millennial terms, pop off and challenge Israel. Peradventure, David decided, hey, Joab, handle my light work and call me if you need me, so that during this time, he could do other things like be a normal person. Maybe. This is me. So during this time, what we do know is that David was in the process of gathering gold and silver and wood and bronze from the nations around. As he went out to battle and in conquest, they were taking the wealth of other nations as well as their territory and putting them into service. So what you had in Israel was something that was different than before, right? You had a nation, right, that at first was like a closed system. It was Israel. But as they began to subdue people and then take in people that they didn't kill as servants, now you have people that have to be ruled over. Because if you take in people from another nation into your land and then you leave, right, there is the possibility of an uprising. Like, would these people then bring in their old ways and their old gods and then turn the people away? Just theorizing. There was much to be worried about. Also, with Israel collecting, and not specifically Israel, but David collecting for the purpose of the building of the temple that Yah talked about later on. And in a previous chapter, we get to that. He has all this stuff. So now Israel becomes a treasure city. Jerusalem is this treasure city full of all this wealth, which now makes you a lame duck in a lot of ways, where people are going to now not just want to come in and get the territory, but they want to come back and get their goods. We learn in the previous chapters also that David gave the wealth that he gathered from other nations as a tribute to Yah and his temple. So then people knew, of course, where their stuff was. So you get these uprisings, and there has to be battle now to keep people away. Now, I don't want to speak amiss by saying that David did something wrong. I'm not going to do that. But what must be noted is that David was supposed to go to war as captain of Yah's army. It was a part of his job description. Now, before we start getting judgy, yes, I made that up. How many of you have a job description from Yah, but also have passions? And how do you try and justify your passions as kingdom business, only to neglect the work that Yah has set before you? We're going to get to that in a second. Just think about that for a second. David had a job description. Yah said, you are going to be a captain over my army. You are going to rule my people. We know that the kings are supposed to go out to war, but David had a passion toward Yah's temple. And so he had something that he was doing. And in the process, if you will, of gathering that, maybe that's why he stayed back. Second plausible reason. David had a lot to lose. David was in the process of gathering gold, silver, bronze, and cedar for the house of Yahuwah. And the ark of Israel had now become a treasure. And the ark of Israel was, the ark of Yah was in Israel. So David didn't only have literal wealth, but he also had physical wealth. He had children and wives. So then another plausible reason is, could David have stayed back to protect the assets of the kingdom and his own assets, his wives and his children? Did one of the part of the army go out to battle and others acted as a reserve for the nation so that nothing was left vulnerable? This could have definitely been the case and could have been a decision based on the reality of the past. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, David goes out to battle with the Philistines, or tries to, they don't let him. And as he goes out, the men leave the women and the children behind. The Amalekites come in, take everyone and their stuff. And the men of the army, the men that were with David, said, we had to stone you. We went with you, we followed you, and this got left behind. Could his decision have been based upon the past? Can our assets cause us to make different decisions? So maybe David was being surety, if you would, for the men and their families, saying, okay, if you go out, some of us will stay back. That allows me to do the work that I'm passionate about. And that also allows for us to continue expanding our boundaries as has been commanded by Yah, and everybody's protected. It's an interesting reality that when we have wealth, we think differently. We think that prosperity creates more freedom, but in reality, it ties us in with continued maintenance. There is a such thing as freedom with contentment. But the more you have, the more complex the decisions are in order to maintain and sustain what you have. It's not always a negative, rather, it's just a reality. David had gathered to himself a lot. One of the things that Torah tells kings not to gather is wives. talks about a quality seed, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But he gathered to himself wives. It meant that he had more children, which means that he has more things to consider. See, David's life was simple before. Somebody's rising up against you, leave, right? You go out. If an enemy comes against Israel, I go into battle. But what happens when Yah calls, and then because of the life that we wanted, that we asked for is happening, and then we hesitate. We hesitate. This is where I believe David is. David had gathered to himself, like I said, a lot, and now simply leaving every time someone flexed was not, or maybe could not be the case for him. So what was David's assignment? When David wanted to build a house for Yah, because that's what David is doing currently, he's battling when he has to, but we also learn as we continue reading the text that David spent the rest of his life literally gathering resources for the temple. Excuse me. David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 asked Yah, well, first he didn't ask Yah, Nathan told him that he could, about, excuse me. It's not water, it's just breathing. Okay. So David wanted to build a house for Yah in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And Nathan the prophet, if you guys, we went through this in 2 Samuel chapter 7, so I won't belabor it. He says, you know what? Yah is with you, build him a house. And Yah comes back to him and he tells him something. And I want to get into this because I believe this is the most significant portion of David's tarrying. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 7. And it says, and it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and Yahuwah had given him rest about from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, see now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of Yah dwell within curtains. And Nathan said to the king, go do all that is in thine heart, for Yahuwah is with thee. King says this, right? I mean, the prophet says this to the king. And it came to pass at that night that the word of Yahuwah came unto Nathan. So Yah comes back to Nathan. He says, go tell my servant David, thus saith Yahuwah. So you spoke before, now I'm speaking. And listen to what he says. Shalt thou build an house for me to dwell in? Question mark. Whereas I have not dwelled in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but I have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. This is prophetic. I'm going to get to that in a second. In all the places wherein I have walked with all the children of Israel, spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people, saying, why build ye not me a house of cedar? Question mark. Now, therefore, so shalt thou say unto my servant David. That's what he's saying. Thus saith Yahuwah of hosts, I took thee. So nothing is an answer. He doesn't say, this is not, and build me a house. He asks questions and then he speaks. Okay. And he's telling David, I took thee from the sheepcote, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel. And I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off all thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are in the earth. Moreover, now I'm going to tell you what to do. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel. I have a place for my people. And he says, and will plant them, and they may dwell in a place of their own. So he's saying, I'm preparing a place. I'm doing something, okay? And move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them anymore as before time. I want them to be at rest. This is my desire for the people. And as since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, have caused thee to rest from all thine enemies, and I've even caused you to rest from your enemies. Also, Yahuwah telleth thee that he will make thee an house. And when thy days be fulfilled, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, and I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build an house for my name. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, and I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men, but my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so did Nathan speak unto David. Why is this significant? David had a job, and his job, and he actually says it in a little bit later, we'll see it. He tells his son Solomon, Yah didn't tell me to build a house. That's not what Yah told me to do. You're going to build a house. It's interesting because when we view our prophets, our preachers, our kings, our teachers in scripture, we view them through rose-colored glasses, and we view them like they understood everything perfectly. And that wasn't always the case. They were learning as they were going, and they were learning how to align their desires with those of Yah. So Yah gave his response, and he gave David his assignment. He says, you're supposed to rule over my people Israel, and I'm going to do something for you. David should have, I'm not saying he did something wrong, but he should have joined with Yah and built up his house, built up his family. Because what Yah was saying, and David actually gets it later, we see it in the Psalm. Yah was telling him, I'm going to do something, not right now, not with a physical house. You think if I wanted a house, I could have. They had willing people. We had wealth coming out of Egypt. I didn't ask them to build me a house. I gave directions. I gave a pattern. I did something. And just so you don't think I'm making this up, Yah even echoes the same thing the psalm. He's like, it's nice of you, but you know I don't dwell in houses built by men. Yah never changed his mind because Yah already has and had a plan. I'll get to that in a second. So David's job, right, was to build up his house in obedience to Torah, so that the kingdom would last forever, because the people, his children, would be obedient to Yah. Well, we're going to see later on, spoiler alert, because we may or may not get this far into the Kings, we see that David's son, Solomon, goes a-whoring after idols because of women. And then we see the nation split literally just 2 generations after David. And just 2 chapters later, we're going to see David's whole household crumble because of the decisions of this chapter here. So the fortifying of the house and the gathering of wealth were imbalanced. The fortifying of the house should have been the establishment of Torah in the home, and not the building up of resources to build a physical house that would only be torn down because the people in the nation are going to go wicked. It would have been better to put the treasure into the people, into the earthen vessels, if you will, instead of storing up treasure for a building that every nation that is going to come is going to ravish until now we have no temple at all. That was not Yah's picture. It gives a picture of the nation, just like when they asked for a king. He obliges. Why? It shows you something about you and your relationship with me. You want a temple? Build one. It's nice, but I'm going to tell you, I will tear this thing down to the ground, is what he tells Samuel, if you guys don't obey me. So if you knew the continuation of your seed was in their obedience to Yah, then the work would not have been to gather wood and stone, but to raise up a quality seed instead of a quantity seed. Clearly, Yah's emphasis was not the physical house, but rather the spiritual part of it, the raising up a seed that would continue, because seed bears after its own kind. Righteous seed bears righteous seed. And it continues if that is pushed into every generation and it's carried out. So what David didn't know, this is just about the house, is that Yah had already provided for himself a temple and a dwelling place, but the time hadn't come. So he's like, it's cute that you want to help me, but I've prepared myself a body. I've always walked among the people. I don't need a house of wood and stone, because when the time comes and when the people need to look to me and look to something, I've already prepared that something. And it's the same something that has been walking with them this whole entire time. I don't need man to build me a temple. I'm going to dwell in a temple forever amongst my people. But since it doesn't necessarily go against it, I'm going to let you, but I'll also tell you that you'll also see the picture of what your sin will do to that temple if you don't obey me. And so David missed that, I think, at this point. Later on, David actually is the one who pins the psalm that says, and you have prepared a body for me. That's David that pins that. So eventually it gets it. But you can see how you can have a person, or even us, have one understanding and want to, in a way, assist Yah. And Yah is just saying, I just need you to play your part. I got this part. Just do what I've asked you to do. David had an assignment. All right, let's keep going. Let's get into it. All right, we're actually going into verse 2. So I told you, I don't know how we're going to make it through all of this in one day. So that's why we cut it up. All right, let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 11. And we're going to look at the driving Hebrew word for this text. The first one is teshuvah. It's interesting that the new year, or the return of the year, is not called Abib, even though it is the spring, but it's called teshuvah, because the thematic effect here is that we're going to see a turn, and then eventually we'll see repentance. Okay, so shuv means to turn. Teshuvah is like to turn or to repent. Okay, but the second most popular word that we see in this text is sent. I didn't realize how important the term sent was until I went through this text. So we're actually going to look at the term sent so that we can get a better understanding again of what is happening and what we are being taught in this text. So I'm going to give you a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word sent is used over and over again in this chapter. I think we should take a couple of minutes and just look at this word because it's a driving theme. So the Hebrew word sent is the word shalach, shalach in this text, shalach. I'm going to write it down for you guys. All right. So this is the word, it's the word shin, lamet, chet. Okay. And in the pictograph form, it looks like this. And it's like two front teeth, which mean to eat, consume, destroy. A shepherd's staff, which means to control, to prod, to move something toward something. And a fence wall or a separation. That's the het, and that's exactly what it means. So what we have here in this word is what it means is to send something out, to send something in a direction, shalach, to go, to send, to move toward a goal, to move something toward a goal. Now, right away in that word, as I was going through the study, I'm like, well, that doesn't give me the fullness of what it means to sin. The word, and not all words do this, but this one does. This particular word does. The word actually breaks down into two-letter roots. So shin lamet means to quiet, and it is specifically related to the quietness that comes in prosperity. Okay. And if you go on this side, you look at lamet het, then this means outside authority or authority of the tongue. So the ability to send in this way, to send and have somebody perform something, comes with a certain amount of power and prosperity. It means that there's a certain amount of reverence given to the one that's given the command, and that the person on the receiving end feels obligated, if you will, to perform what the person sending has them doing. Okay, we're going to see this word used over and over again. It's going to blow your mind. Okay, so prosperity gives power in this world. The word of those who are prosperous cause people to often pervert judgment. No amount of money or prestige, though, should put a person above the law. But what we're going to see is that a prosperous person can get servants to bend rules, to get women to come, to get friends to turn a blind eye, and all because they would rather find favor in the eyes of the prosperous than think about Yah. Pay attention as we go through this to the authority that is at play in this narrative, and look at how many times Yah is consulted. Let me stop my share here. Okay, we're going to go back into our text. Give me 1 second to make sure I have everything up on the screen, because I personally don't want to miss anything. Before we dive deep, though, I want to make sure we keep these couple of notes in the back of our head. I kind of started with this. Not in a way to put any single person on a pedestal, but David is better than us. We got to keep that in mind. It's a very important thing to keep, because we don't want to find ourselves sitting in the seat of condemnation. And the reason why I say this is David is what, like I said, called a man after Yah's own heart. The text in 1 Chronicles 18 and 14 and 1 Kings and 15:5 says that. In one account, Yah says that David is blameless except for in the matter of Uriah. That's what we're going to read. And in the second, and in the other text, it says that he ruled just and executed Yah's will. So we don't want to take one event or two or three events in a person's life that Yah gives as a teaching moment to then scrap the whole person. Because in Christianity, what happened is all they talked about was everybody said all this stuff about David, but David slept with Bathsheba, and David, they don't even really get to the David killing Uriah part, because that was David's main concern in Psalm 51. It really rests solely on David's transgression with Bathsheba. And what happens is, what it did in Christianity, and I think what it does to people in general, what it does to religion, what it does to just humanity, is when a person stumbles, we don't want to hear what they have to say. Like all of a sudden they're not credible. And I believe that so many more people would seek and understand Torah if they didn't lump David and Torah together in that sense, because David writes and pins some of the most profound prophecy concerning the Messiah, but people, now have picked him apart because of his transgression, and they've done him just like everybody else. We like some of the stuff you say, but we're not going to read all the stuff you say, because this blip on your record somehow keeps us from hearing you. He's the greatest psalmist to ever live, the greatest, second to the Hamashiach, the greatest prophets to ever live, and is Yah's king, period. So as we're traveling through this, I have to put that down as as a form of respect. Like, I don't ever want to find myself, and I don't want you all to have yourself sit in the seat of condemnation on somebody that Yah, in the sense, didn't have that level of condemnation for. Yah does execute judgment. Yah does take into account human error. Yah is just, and Yah also withholds his hand and brings judgment to correct and not always destroy. That's something we have to keep in mind with this text when we are walking in his will. Okay, here it goes. I had to give all that background. I know it was a lot, but I think too often we don't reverence in a proper way before we touch the texts of our patriarchs and our ancestors. We go into it like it's just stories, and we wouldn't do that. Nobody gets up and talks about their grandma or their grandpa and tells all their business without making sure that that like that's still who it is. That Ishan Burgundy song came in my head right now. Like, I felt that. Like, if you haven't heard that song, go check it out. Okay, let's get to it. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, I'm going to read verse 1 again, just because we have circumvented verse 1 in a serious way and come back around to it. So it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab, Shalach, Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of his house. Okay. Here in the text, we realize something. David's not at rest. He's up. He's in his bed. He gets up and he begins walking. Something, like I said, something is bothering him. Something is on his mind. He's at peace. His enemies are subdued around him. The men are out to battle. And the enemy, they've already pushed him back. It says they had already seized Rabbah, which means they're at the capital city of the Ammonites. They're literally at the gates. They pushed the territory back so far that, this is a point of rejoicing. Something's not right. Something's not balanced. Was it because maybe he should have been at war with his men? Was he worrying about what was happening on the battlefield? We don't know. But the passage says that David walked upon the roof of his house. The Hebrew grammar tells us that David wasn't just like, he didn't just like go up to the roof, but it actually means that he was pacing upon the roof. Like he was walking back and forth in this area, just walking and clearing his mind. He was not at rest. He had something going on up here. David didn't go up to the roof to look for something. He was out walking and thinking. He may have been thinking holy thoughts. He may have been talking to Yah. He may have been praying, for all we know. We know whatever is happening, that he is not at rest. As he's up on the roof, the text continues and it says, and from the roof, he saw a woman washing herself. This word is also in the Hebrew imperfect tense. Just like he was walking and pacing, he saw a woman washing herself, right? And we've all been out. You've all been out and you've seen something and you see, oh, and you keep going. The text says that he saw and then he watched. It's a difference. Same way he walked in pace, he saw and watched. How do we know, even if you didn't know Hebrew, that he saw and he continued to look? Because the text says, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. It takes a while. If you just see somebody naked and you turn your head and you keep going and go back to your business or go inside, you don't get to see that much. But as you look, you're like, There was a pondering in the process. See, where we get caught up at is, it's one thing when sin crosses our path. You see something, sin cross your path, you keep walking. It's a cross of your path because you're continuing across your sin. It's a completely different thing when you entertain it and then dwell on it. Let's go to Matthew chapter 15, verse 19. It says, for out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands defileth no man. So he's talking about, see, when people go into this whole thing, and I'm not, he's saying this is what defiles a man. It's the stuff that comes from your heart. See, Shalach, we talked about, was the authority of the mouth, and he's talking about the heart, the authority within. See, out of the mouth, it speaks the abundance of the heart. So these things, blasphemies, fornications, theft, false witness, it's because it's in your heart first. And then that which is in the heart manifests. See, when sin crosses a person's path and they're walking circumspect to Yah, our job is to cross over. It's actually the literal root word of what a Hebrew is. Aver, it means to cross over into something else, into this newness. And so what the adversary then uses is the entertaining. It's not that we don't ever approach sin. See, I think people think because you're Hebrew, you can't encounter sin. I think it's what makes it worse, is that knowing Yah, knowing Torah, we still carry in us the weed seeds and the propensity to fall to things that we never thought could cause us to stumble. Let's go to the next text I have for this, James chapter 1, and we'll start at verse 12. It says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation, For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which Yahuwah hath promised to them that love him. Okay. Let no man say that he is tempted, or when he is tempted, I am tempted of Yah, for Yah cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempt he any man. We hear from the Hamashiach that it's from your heart. It's the defilement in your heart that tempts you. And so he says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away. Here it is, Jacob, not just James, Jacob echoing the same thing. When he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed, then when lust hath conceived, it bring forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. I see that in our text. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will he begat us with the word of truth, that we should be of a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of Elohim. Wherefore lay apart all filthiness, and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls. Be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. When David is out and he's thinking and he's pacing and he's walking, and whatever has him not in this place of shalom, of rest, even though text says he was resting or about from his enemies for the most part, he sees this woman, he looks upon this woman, and something happens inside. Something is there and it's activated. See, the adversary couldn't get David with the the big stuff, some of the stuff that we're over here puffed up about, like, oh, I don't celebrate Christmas, I don't have idols, I don't celebrate Easter, you have all this list of things that you have put here, right? But I may have a little something on the side, but I think Torah says I can, so that's fine. And I may do X, Y, and Z. And I got kids in my home, and I may not always be around. I'm not checking them like I should. See that a little bit too. And all these things are happening, but we have magnified and glorified in our own triumphs. And it's the little things. It's the little things that come in when the Messiah says, it's like blasphemies and falsehoods and saying stuff that's not true and not doing stuff. And then Jacob goes on, he's like, and just pure old naughtiness. You're just not in your right state. And you're going through, you go, oh, I didn't really think of those things. So the question is, what should be David's next move? He's out here, not at peace for whatever reason, pacing, sees a woman naked. Okay, she's fine. And what's his next move? What will be yours? If you cannot control your anger, if you cannot control your gossip, if you have trouble committing to reading your Bible, loving your neighbor, kingdom work, you can't you can't remember to be obedient to Yah, then you can just forget it when trials come. Yeah, like you didn't have to run from your enemy. You didn't have to give reverence in the face of death. We didn't have to do that. And this is just things you ought to have done. See, we are in a really, really interesting predicament as humans and as people following Torah right now, because see, we're struggling with the stuff that has slipped up people easily. We're struggling with the things that are supposed to fortify us against trials and tribulations. And we put our time and our efforts and our energy into other things, and we keep stumbling on the small things. How are we going to avoid something like what David's getting ready to deal with, which is death worthy? Plenty of people justify sex, immorality, idolatry for love, and a bunch of other things. How are we? Because the reality is we don't get off scot-free. This idea of like this rapture idea in everyday life that somehow because I follow Torah, that evil is not ever present, that I will never be tried, that I'll never go through trials, I'll never be tested. We have to leave that mindset because we are not at peace over silly things. I mean, hopefully, I don't know, but hopefully David wasn't at peace just because he wasn't at war. See, we're not at peace because we've already reaped to ourselves death-worthy events and circumstances. And so we're not at peace. And in the process of not being at peace, we're also not reading our word and not studying and finding things that are more important than Yah. How are we going to stand? See, you are wrestling in your mind about David. Like, how could he do that? How could he be looking at that woman? Wasn't he just bringing the ark in? Wasn't he just torn up over, the ox on the cart? And wasn't he just talking? Didn't he just put away a wife for just saying that he was looking at women? Right? This is like all stuff that just recently happened. But compared to him and his devotion to Yah, we don't stand a chance. And the next thing that happens in the text is here. Let's go back to 2 Samuel chapter 11. It says, this is where it gets interesting. So he sees a woman on the house. Verse 3, here it is again. And David, Shalach, and David sent and inquired after the woman. And David inquired. Up until this point, David's inquiries had been to Yahuwah. This time, it says he asked someone. If you go through and you look at the translation, it says that he inquired, like he just asked, like just general conversation. So there was time between the walk, the look, and then what's going to be the lust. He had time to inquire of something, and the inquiry was not of Yah. That is the begin of the turn. See, I think it's interesting that it wasn't even an advisor or maybe one of his wives. Like, hey, y'all know who that is? It was someone who would give him the answer that he wanted to hear. See, David had time to think and consider. Sin is a slippery slope lined with a series of questions and self-fulfilling answers. I'll say it again. Sin is a slippery slope lined with a series of questions and self-fulfilling answers. The person responded. See what the person says. And one said, is what the text said, is not this Bathsheba or Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now you know. Why did he respond in a question? Is not this, maybe. The person responded, isn't that, isn't that Bathsheba, Uriah's wife? I wonder, in my imagination as I was going through this, did he take the person up on the roof like, hey, come here. Her right here. You on the left. No, with the backyard with the little glowing light thing going on with the candlelight. No, with the yellow mezuzah. Nope, to the left, over here, right here with the menorah. That house. Whose house is that? Yeah, that one. Is that how the question? Did he bring the guy up or did he send him down? Like, how did that happen? I don't know, but it had to be that wherever she was and however she was seen, when he pointed out and he asked, he said, like, did he squint? Go like, yeah. That's Eliam. Yeah, Uriah, the homegirl with the, yeah, that's his wife. That was the response. It wasn't like, nope, never seen her before. Like that wasn't the case at all in the text. What's even more interesting is that we know the community was super tight. The person didn't just say, not sure. He gave lineage. He said, this is really what he said. He said, that's Eliam. You know, Eliam, one of your 30 men of valor who fled with you when you were running from Saul. That's his daughter. And she's married to one of your other 30 men, tight men that you roll with, the 30, just a couple of brothers, yeah, that's his wife. And just in case you were not sure, Eliam is Ahithophel, your chief advisor, the guy you talk to all the time. That's his daddy. So that's his granddaughter. That's who that is. It wasn't some and that's just homegirl around the corner. She wasn't that person. So when the text is often painted, you're like, because we are, before when we were reading these passages, didn't know that these were family. We didn't relate to it like that. But now that it's these are people who knew people who weren't and this is the king, and the king just gets what he wants, and he doesn't know any of the subjects in his kingdom. No. That's not how our culture works. So in our culture, Uriah is, one of the homeboys that abandoned from the Hittites. Yeah, he now serves in Yah's army because he abandoned his God to serve ours. He pretty tight like that. That's that kind of community. It wasn't some secret thing. So, and if you're just wondering where I got my rundown, 2 Samuel 23:34, 2 Samuel 15. And there's also some verse in Chronicles, but I didn't write them. Oh, and 1 Chronicles 11, 10 through 47. It's right here. So if you want to go back and put together who's who and what's what, that's where that information can be found. All right. So you have people who know people. These are not strangers. This is a community, okay? Tight-knit community. All right, so let's keep going. So David then, after he gets the response, he doesn't say, oh man, let me go back to bed. That's not his response. So then in verse 4, it says, and David Shalach. And David sent messengers and took her. But before y'all get all up in arms, let's look at it. And she came in unto him. So I've heard this story mentioned as one of a power struggle. It's the king. How could you tell the king no? We are not Europeans who have an all-powerful king who wields unrestricted power. This is Israel we're talking about. It is a sin unto death to lay with a man's wife. It is a sin unto death for a married woman to lay with a married man. This is not a place where I don't know, maybe we might die if we do this. Everybody knew it wasn't a game. Okay, so this is not she was oh no, don't take me. And he just snatched her and then he raped her and then, The text says David Shalach, and then Bathsheba is going to bow. She's going to come. See, she could have said no. Now, I know people are well, how did she know what he was calling her there for? The text also gives us that too. So let's walk through it. All right. So he sends a messenger. The king would like to see you. And then let's just say she had no thing. She's oh, okay. She goes. And then this is what's happened. So, and he lay with her. So you're oh, okay. So he came, no conversation, no nothing. She just came and then he was drop it. She's okay. The text says here, for she was purified from her uncleanness and she returned unto her house. So he calls, she came. Somewhere in between him laying with her and her going back home, there was a conversation of, well, I saw you out there bathing and, in our culture, I can't lay with you because it's an abomination because you unclean. So you on your cycle or it's no, I'm good. And then they get together. It's, how did he know? She was purified from uncleanness. See, the physical purity of her was more important than I guess the spiritual wickedness and physical wickedness of what was getting ready to happen. So she comes, he lay with her, and then she just left. It was time, space, and opportunity. We read earlier that sin will then turn into death, which starts with just a thought. And the thought turns into an action, and then space and time and opportunity come together. Now, it's interesting because it doesn't just stop there. This was not an encounter of strangers. See, I don't want people to think that. We covered that with the rundown of the genealogy. And it wasn't rape. There was conversation, even if it was brief. And he still never inquired of Yah. You had a conversation with her, laid with her, and never thought about the intimacy of Yah. See, we think it's strange to involve Yah in every decision that we make, especially decisions of marriage and sex. See, we will let marriage and sex motivate us to be with somebody who's like kind of into her, like he still eat pork sometimes, but, or I know there's all these signs, but we're so hung up on this, on futile things. And Yah's like, I want to be a part of everything, and not just to be a part of it, but like we talked about earlier, I want to be a part of it to the point that you listen to me when I tell you otherwise. See, the issue with our people is that I'm included in this, have not come to the full realization, we're coming to it, that our lives really aren't ours. We all have these little areas that are off limits to Yah, and we categorize them under, Yah doesn't really care about that. Like, yeah, no, he said it. We fall into this category. We go back into our Genesis chapter 3 mindset, which is, did Yah say you would surely die? And so we teeter-totter on the edge of sin all the time. Like all the time. We don't think of it because we think there are big sins and little sins. See, all disobedience is worthy of death. The scripture says that the wages of sin, period, is death. But we flirt on the line and we choose to make decisions that we think are like white lies or small sins, or I don't have to ask Yah for that. Or even if it's not a sin, the simple fact that we don't think to consult Yah before we do things, because we're like, but that's what I want. And why would that be against Yah's will? Doesn't he want me to have that? That's what I've always wanted. These are my dreams. These are my goals. These are my aspirations. Going back to what we talked about earlier with David. It's like, hey man, you might want to deal with you, your heart, your house. I don't need a house. But we're like, but I really want to do that. And it's like, okay, you're missing it. We all fall in that place. We're like, but I want to see this, and I want to make this thing happen, and I want to go this place in ministry, and I want to write this. And yeah, I was like, how about you worry about this? How about you cultivate what you already have? How about you instill things into your children? How about you love your husband? How about you take some time and spend time with them? But but if I do this, then of course, yeah, you'll be pleased. And he's like, actually, if you just played Uno with your kids, I'd be pleased too. We have those little areas. So we all have these little areas that are off limits, and we categorize them, like I was saying. But truly, me first, we should pray before we buy shoes. We should pray on our majors in college, not like, I like this. We should pray for our children's majors in college. Like, they're really good at this. And what does Yah want from this family? See, we should pray before we plan to do things. We should pray before we choose friends. We should pray before we even begin liking members of the opposite sex. Because see, what happens is once you start liking people, even with friends, once you start being friends with people, you start overlooking things like, but she's cool. Like, but no, absolutely not. We should pray before we start liking members of the opposite. Well, yeah, he writes me notes and I'm starting to feel something about him. I know he got some quirks, but we can work it out. So then you start praying to Yah to fix the person instead of praying to Yah before you even like the person. Makes no sense. We should pray before we send a text message, or after a person sends you a text message that you ain't heard from for a while, and start up a conversation that you shouldn't be having. See how man chooses to do things and how Yah has them set up is just completely opposite. See, we can, with careful consideration and prayer and inquiry to Yah, really not run into a lot of the stuff that we run into on a regular basis. And we would stay out of or get away from the chances of fulfilling the flesh, just period, with whatever it is. If we just ask Yah, but the reason why we don't ask Yah, because we already know what the answer is going to be. No, Or have you considered this? Or then you start thinking, well, if I do this and I do this, and then we don't like that process, because then we get upset when we have to think about things and we have to consider why we've made decisions, or then we don't unravel the decision. See, when he called her to the house, he could have said, you know, this is a bad idea. But once you get into it, it's like, well, I'm already here. So then we keep finding ways to continue to do the things that we have already made up in our minds that we weren't supposed to do in the first place. It's hard. It's hard to unravel. Maybe I'll be 33 soon. And I think of things that I've had to apologize for in relationship, or go back on, or say, dang, you were right about this. I shouldn't have done this. Or even I found myself the other morning, I got up and I thought that I was a pretty sharp 20-year-old. Like my 20s, I thought I made some good decisions. I know I made some bad ones, but I thought like my good outweighed my bad. I started looking and I was like, gosh, you were so ungrateful. Gosh, you were so hard-headed. Gosh, God gave you people around to tell you that you would come around 10 years later and say, yeah, this is not that important. I sat around and I thought about how you perceive something in one way in your mind and it's completely different. I sat around and I said, man, had I asked Yah, had I listened, had I inquired, what things would I've done differently? Even with paths and education and jobs, I fought for a long time. Like the last thing I wanted to do was be a teacher, and did it, but it was like fighting tooth and nail. And then I realized that it wasn't just something that when you get a piece of paper, it means that you've actually done something. No, it's the beginning of education. It's beginning of a life work. Even in studying, learning to ask, like before, I'm like, man, I studied so many things. And I'm looping back around to things that was like, and this is what I wanted you to focus on. And this is what I wanted you to get under your belt. See, you would have made it through all this if you would have done what I said to do first. But I'm running in the rat race and on the rabbit wheel, trying to keep up with what I think other people are learning or how people are learning things fast. Me, I was like, what I have for you to learn is for your season. What I have for them to get is for their season. But all this time, instead of asking, what do you want me to do? And then trusting that when he tells us what he wants us to do, it is actually going to have a positive outcome. Like we are scared to follow. We're scared to ask him because we still want to do what we want to do. We don't see how our dreams, gifts, and abilities fit into his plan. So then we wield our own path only to come around, sometimes with less time on our clock and with less resource to do the same thing he asked us to do in the beginning. He's never, if you're alive, taking obedience off the table. And so as I sat back and I repented, I was like, gosh, I was really ignorant. I have a spouse who's like, hey, you're really good at this. Hey, don't get caught up on that. Hey, make sure you do this. Hey, I know you want to do this, but at the same time saying, okay, we'll see. And the same way that Yah is often with us, we see definitely our relationship with Yah reflecting our relationship with our friends and spouses and our children. You go, man, I'm here saying the same thing that has been said to me, but at the time I didn't want to hear it. This is what I want to do right now. I'm like, yep. And the tall order that I thought was tall is still there. And I still have to chip away at it the same exact way. But we want to fulfill ourselves. And in this sense, David fulfills himself. He has wives, plural, and concubines, plural. And he's out looking for whatever uneasy, unfulfilled reason he has for something else. And then with all that, he takes somebody else's wife. I want to add that in this text, what we see is whoever sent and brought her, and whoever stood guard, and I don't know how his wives and everybody else didn't know what he's supposed to die. See, our sin is worthy of death. It's hard to say that about somebody like David, but what he does is worthy of death. And the hating of the people around him shows the lack of love that the people around have because they don't say nothing. See, when we sin, we don't want anybody to say anything. You're like, you a hater. You don't want me to do. I'm saying something because you're going to hate me later if I don't. You're going to hate me when whatever the case is, separates, makes people go separate ways, kills people. You're going to wish that somebody had said something. Nobody wants to hear it. I know right now it's like the big thing floating around. Nobody wants to hear about the spiritual adultery of the holidays that are coming up. Nobody wants to hear about what the origin of things are. Nobody wants to hear that they're getting ready to commit spiritual adultery. Nobody wants to hear that what they're doing is worthy of death because it looks fun. It feels fun. You see that tree over there around the corner at the house? The whole thing, same exact thing. Nobody wants you to say anything because from their vantage point, they see a means to an end. And from our vantage point, we don't see that. We see death and destruction. But do we just turn a blind eye and say, well, they'll come around. Oh, well, the kids, no. What do? We separate ourselves. And for those who have an ear that'll hear, we do speak out. And then eventually we just let it be. And that is the reality of what's happening right now. I was given an analogy to my mom the other day, and I'll share with you guys. I was talking about what has caused spiritual wickedness, and definitely during this time Christmas, to look like to me. And I was telling her it reminds me, and to think that like I participated in any capacity at any point in my life is just really disheartening. It reminds me of child pedophilia. I know that's harsh, and somebody's like, I can't believe. Hear me out. When adults introduce adult things to children disguised as play, that is classic pedophile behavior. See, what you do is say, I know this thing is not child friendly, but I'm going to make it child friendly only to cause that child to later one day realize the debauchery of it and continue in it. Because what does it produce? It starts off with just gifts and exchanging and putting them in the holiday spirit. And then eventually it turns into sex and drunkenness and gluttony and causes them to sin against Yah. So you have these things that, especially for people of color, for Black people, we don't do. Like, you can't even sit on your uncle's lap in our culture. Like, people can't pick up little girls. Yet for one day out of the year, all of a sudden that's okay. It's okay to sit little girls and little boys on random white men's laps so that they'll give them things. And you don't think our daughters are going to turn out to be whores? And you don't think our sons are going to be turned out to be confused? It's weird. You tell them, if you don't do this, I'm not going to do this. And if you act like that, I'm going to take this. And so then when people actually come to defile your children and say, if you tell your mom, then you set them up. You set them up for failure. This whole, like, if you don't do, no. Obedience is not optional. I don't have to give you a gift for obedience. You do it. See how we set up these weird things and then we produce a further, more wicked generation because then they're stuck in it. So you've introduced them to it. See, we don't see what we do in conjunction with what a person like David did, where you knew what happened. If you prayed to Yah and asked him, should you celebrate Christmas? He say no. The answer would be no, but you don't want to ask. You don't want to inquire because you're like, I'm just going to do it one more year. I'm going to do it one more year. And this is going to be my last year doing it. And then I know it's pagan, but it's for the kids. And you don't realize that you're sending your kids into spiritual idolatry. You're disrupting your household, and Yah is trying to build a righteous nation, right? Or you slightly mimicking it, doing closely compared things, but not quite Christmas. No, the reality is we have to get it correct. All right, let's continue. Got a little bit more to go. All right, here's that Shalach again. So he sends for her, she returns to her house. Spiritual and physical sin has been committed. Verse 5, and the woman conceived and sent. Now she sent in Shalach and told David and said, I am with child. There was no doubt that this was David's baby. It's not like the whole hood life narrative, like was she sleep with a bunch of people? No, the story is actually lined up perfect. She had just came off her cycle. Her husband's away at war. David's out walking. He sends for her. We don't even hear them having much conversation after that. And then she sins and she's pregnant. It's interesting that she sins, but she doesn't come. She doesn't come back up. She's like, why? Because now my sin has conception has come. I'm about to die. See, you might get off because you're king, but you ain't gonna look at me the same way. I'm pregnant. My husband's at war. Ain't no way around this one. I ain't like I went out to the battlefield and got some. Like, just being candid. That's just the reality. So she sins privately. Now it's like, oh yeah, I was sneaking. You still sneaking. There is a shame that comes when we have to stare our sin in the face. See, in our culture, because our wickedness has exceeded probably everything of every other culture, in this society, we kill babies. See, she wouldn't even have to call like, my husband going, I got pregnant, I'm gonna kill this baby. See, they didn't quite, not yet, cover sin with sin. Her thing was, okay, what are we gonna do? She didn't go off and find the neighborhood witch doctor and kill the baby. She's like, I'm pregnant. This is the reality of people having sex. And now, if I wasn't dead, because somebody found out I came, which I probably could have denied, I'm dead now. So she sins. And based upon the text, we don't see that they continued to hook up. We see it as she came that day, she went home. It was kind of, that little hit it and quit it, I guess. And she went about her way. It wasn't until her cycle was due to come around again that the fullness of her transgression was upon them. See, like us, they think they got away with it. I'm like, oh, okay, it happened. It'll never happen again. It was just this one time and it's done. How often do we sin and think it's, okay, I'm okay because I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to backtrack. It was like, there was that one time and I'm not going to do it again. Nope. Sin said, not today. We don't get to determine the consequences of our sins, and we don't get to write the screenplay for the outcome. Like, that is the reality. What happens is a child is now conceived, and now it's like, it's royal seed. It's King David's baby, and how am I going to get around this? Let's see what our king does. So she sins and told David, I'm a child. This is what David does. And David, Shalach, David sent to Joab. David still has not called on Yah. If nothing would have got you down on your knees, it's like, not only did I do this, but now she's pregnant, I got to pray. He's still taking things into his own hands, which goes back to the beginning. We don't know what David was going through. I don't know. We don't know. I mean, we inferred in the beginning, but we don't know. So he sends Joab. He sent to Joab, like, hey, I got to call a friend. What do we do when we get into stuff? He says, okay, I know you're not going to believe this, but this is why do we do that? Not pray. We're trying to justify and talk ourselves into somehow being right about the wrong that we've done. This time he sends a Joab. This is what he says. Saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And guess what? Joab Shalach. Joab sent Uriah to David. Now, why didn't he send for Uriah when he was inquiring of his wife? Right? Like, you knew exactly where he was. Why? If he was concerned, he should have contacted him to come home because his wife was outside bathing and looking lonely. I'm just kidding. A true brother would not have slept with his wife and definitely wouldn't do the next trifling act. See, I theorize that they felt safe having their king look over their family. And now the king has created wickedness in Israel. And he sends for Uriah. Text said Joab sent Uriah to David. So we'll pick up next week. We're going to pick up, and I think we'll be able to wrap up next week because the story swiftly progresses. But I really wanted to lay the background for what was happening in the text. I wanted us to be able to look in, see, feel, experience what was happening, because there is no shortage of wickedness happening in our text. There's no shortage of it's presumptuous sin is what the text is, what the Bible calls it. It is a sin that is done with the intent of doing exactly what it is. We say we don't know. I don't know. No, we know what we're doing. We know why we're doing it. And we're just uncomfortable because of pride. And I guess maybe a little bit of fear of saying, I'm doing it because I want to do it. Presumptuous sin is a sin that is not coverable. It is a blatant sin, and it comes with a cost. It comes with a cost. It's not an accidental sin. It's not a slip up and I fell into bed with Uriah's wife. No, I calculated it. I thought about it, and the thought will continue, and it actually does not end at all positive. So join us back here next week for part 2 of David and Bathsheba. And we'll look at who sent, what happens, and what the final outcome is.